She was barefoot, hugging a teddy bear at a bus stop, until a millionaire CEO stopped his car and changed her life forever. The night had settled over the city with a chill that made the air sting against the skin, the kind of cold that crept through clothing and clung to the bones. Streetlights buzzed weakly, casting yellow halos across the wet pavement where the rain had only just stopped, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the neon signs of small shops still open along the road. At the bus stop, under a flickering lamp, a small figure stood alone. She was so little that from a distance she could have been mistaken for a shadow, a forgotten bundle left behind by a careless traveler. But as one drew closer, the truth was more devastating. The child's name was Emily Carter, though no one passing her by knew or cared to ask. She was only 5 years old, a frail slip of a girl with hair the color of pale wheat and skin so fair it almost glowed against the darkness. She wore nothing but a thin light yellow t-shirt and a pair of white pajama pants, fabric soaked in patches from the damp night air. Her bare feet pressed against the cold concrete, the skin reddened and raw, yet she did not cry. Instead, she clutched to her chest a small stuffed teddy bear, its one soft fur worn down from years of being held too tightly, as though it alone could give her warmth. She curled herself around it, whispering into its head as if it could listen, and tried to convince herself she wasn't shivering. People passed her by in waves, the way they always do in cities, glancing quickly, recognizing something unusual, then choosing to look away. A few slowed for a moment, curiosity flickering across their faces, but the sight of a barefoot child in pajamas, clutching a toy in the cold, was too uncomfortable to confront. Better, it seemed, to pretend she was someone else's problem, a trick of circumstance that would be resolved when her parents inevitably arrived. So they walked on, leaving her behind with nothing but the sound of car engines and the occasional hiss of the bus brakes stopping and starting down the street. Emily's eyes were wide and glassy, her lips slightly parted as she breathed against the bear's fur. She had been standing there for what felt to her like hours, though time for a child stretches and bends in cruel ways. Every set of headlights that turned down the road made her heart leap, every stranger's footstep sent her gaze darting upward with hope that dissolved instantly when no familiar figure appeared. Her father's voice still rang in her ears, cold and final, telling her she wasn't wanted, leaving her at the stop with the vague promise that she should stay put. She obeyed because she knew no other way to survive. The rules of childhood are simple, you do as you're told. Only now, doing so had left her in the middle of the night, abandoned to the elements. The city around her seemed almost alive, humming with a rhythm she could not match. Cars moved too fast, people spoke too loudly, the world carried on while she stood still, frozen in more ways than one. The teddy bear was the only constant, the only reminder that she wasn't entirely invisible. She pressed her cheek against it, rocking slightly on her bare feet, whispering nonsense words she invented to soothe herself. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and her throat felt tight from the cold, but she did not cry for help. Children abandoned long enough learn quickly that no one comes when you cry, and she had learned that lesson faster than most. The night deepened, the chill sharpened, and the bus stop grew emptier. The lights from the nearby shops dimmed as closing hours passed, leaving only the glow of the street lamp and the sound of the wind that whistled through the deserted road. Emily's head drooped against the bear, her eyelids heavy, but she forced herself to stay awake because sleep meant weakness, and weakness meant being left behind even further. She did not know that her small figure had begun to draw attention not from the passers-by who hurried along the sidewalk, but from a man who had stopped his car in the middle of the street and was now watching her with disbelief, his instincts torn between logic and the sudden, unshakable certainty that fate had led him to this moment. Richard Hunter had not planned to stop that night. His schedule rarely allowed interruptions, every moment accounted for with precision, every destination chosen for efficiency. He was on his way to a late dinner with investors who had flown in from overseas, his mind full of numbers, contracts, and strategies, but when his headlights swept across the bus stop, something caught his attention that made him slow the car almost without conscious thought. At first it seemed like nothing more than a child waiting for her parents, but as he glanced again, the detail struck him with a force that left no room for dismissal. She was barefoot, standing in the damp chill of the night, wearing nothing but thin clothing more suited to sleep than to the street, clutching a stuffed toy as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. He pulled the car to the curb and turned off the engine, sitting for a moment with his hands resting on the steering wheel, debating whether to step out. Logic urged him to keep driving. He was a powerful man with a reputation to protect, not someone who wandered into strangers' problems. But there was something in the way she held herself, a fragile defiance against the cold, that unsettled him. He opened the door and stepped into the night, his polished shoes clicking against the wet pavement. As he approached, the girl's eyes lifted toward him. They were large and unblinking, brown as deep earth, reflecting both fear and an aching kind of hope. She didn't step back, but she didn't move toward him either. She simply clutched the bear tighter, her knuckles pale from the pressure, as if bracing herself for whatever came next. Richard crouched down a few feet away so he wouldn't tower over her, his tailored light blue suit catching the glow of the streetlight. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his voice calm, almost gentle, though beneath it lay the steel edge of disbelief that any parent could leave a child like this. For a moment she didn't respond. Then, in a voice so small he almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "Daddy said I'm not needed anymore. He left." The words were delivered without tears, without anger, spoken with the flat resignation of someone too young to understand but too aware to deny the truth. Richard felt his breath catch. He had closed multi-million-dollar deals, faced scandals, endured betrayals in boardrooms, but nothing had ever disarmed him like those few words spoken by a 5-year-old. He looked at her thin arms, the bare feet pressed against the concrete, the way her shoulders curled inward as though she was trying to disappear into herself, and he knew he could not walk away. "Are you cold?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. She nodded once, so slightly he almost missed it. Without another word he rose, strode quickly to the small shop across the street, and returned minutes later with a thick child's jacket he had bought off the rack. He knelt again and gently eased it around her shoulders. She stiffened at first, not used to kindness, but as the warmth spread, she relaxed just enough for him to zip it up. Richard studied her carefully, the lines of his face softening despite the intensity in his blue eyes. "What's your name?" "Emily," she whispered, her voice trembling as though saying her name out loud might make it disappear. "Emily," he repeated, steady and firm, grounding her in that moment. "That's a strong name." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you have anywhere to go?" She shook her head, silent tears finally spilling down her cheeks though she didn't make a sound. It was as though she had run out of strength to hold them back. Richard's hand hovered in the air for a moment before he reached out, not to grab, but to offer. He extended his palm toward her, his gaze unwavering. "Then come with me. You don't have to stay here anymore." The world around them continued to move, cars driving by, the wind picking up again, neon signs flickering, but in that moment it felt as though everything had narrowed down to a choice between despair and hope. Emily stared at his hand, hesitant, terrified of trusting and yet desperate for someone to trust. Slowly, cautiously, she placed her tiny hand into his, and the weight of that gesture was heavier than any contract Richard had ever signed. He rose to his full height, her hand in his, and felt the cold bite at her skin against his warmth. He tightened his grip just enough to reassure her without frightening her. For the first time in years, Richard Hunter, millionaire, CEO, a man who thought his life was already full, realized he had stepped into something far greater than himself. Emily had gone from being a stranger at a bus stop to someone he could not, would not, abandon. And as they walked toward his car together, her small figure dwarfed by his broad frame, he knew that nothing about his life would ever be the same again. The car ride away from the bus stop unfolded in heavy silence, the kind that carried not comfort but fragile uncertainty. Emily sat in the back seat, the oversized jacket swallowing her small frame, her legs curled beneath her as if she were trying to make herself as small as possible. The teddy bear never left her arms, she clung to it with the desperate tenacity of someone who knew it was the last piece of stability she had. Richard adjusted the rearview mirror more than once, not because he needed to check the road, but because he couldn't stop himself from glancing at her. Each time, he saw the same image, wide brown eyes staring not out the window but into some invisible distance, as though she were waiting to be awakened from a nightmare. The mansion loomed into view after a quiet drive through darkened streets lined with trees that glistened under the glow of streetlights. Richard's home had always been a monument to his success, a place designed to impress business associates and shelter him from the noise of the world. Its tall iron gates opened silently as the car approached, and the long driveway led to a sprawling house with windows glowing warm in contrast to the chill outside. When he stepped out of the car, Emily hesitated, her small body rigid with caution, as though she feared stepping onto unfamiliar ground. He extended his hand again, patient and steady, and after a moment she slid her tiny fingers into his. Inside, the warmth of the house enveloped them, but Emily didn't relax. She stood in the foyer, her eyes darting across the marble floor, the towering staircase, the paintings on the walls, as though she had been dropped into a world too polished, too unreal, to belong to her. Richard handed his coat to the butler and dismissed him for the night, wanting privacy. Emily's bare feet left faint marks on the cold floor as she shuffled forward, hugging her bear even tighter. He guided her into the living room, where the fireplace glowed with embers from earlier in the evening. The warmth spread through the space, but Emily remained huddled in her jacket, her knees tucked up beneath her chin on the edge of an armchair. Richard crouched beside her, keeping his voice low. "Are you hungry?" She nodded faintly but didn't speak. He walked to the kitchen and returned with a small plate of bread and fruit, setting it gently on the table beside her. She hesitated, glancing at him as though waiting for permission, and only when he nodded did she take a piece of bread, nibbling carefully as if she expected it to be taken away at any moment. Richard sat in the chair across from her, watching not with impatience but with the quiet intensity of someone trying to understand. This was a girl who had been abandoned, left in the cold with nothing but a toy to shield her. She didn't need grand gestures of wealth, she needed proof that she was safe, that the ground beneath her feet wouldn't disappear again. When she finally finished eating, she leaned back, exhaustion pulling at her features. He asked her softly, "Do you want to rest?" She shook her head, clutching the bear tighter, her eyes flickering with fear. It struck him then that she wasn't afraid of the dark or of being alone in a strange room, she was afraid that if she let her guard down, everything she had been given in the last few hours would vanish. Not wanting to push her, Richard offered her a blanket instead. He draped it gently across her shoulders, and for the first time since he had met her, she didn't resist. She settled deeper into the chair, her eyelids drooping despite her obvious determination to stay awake. Within minutes, her breathing slowed, and she drifted into sleep with the bear still clutched in her arms. Richard sat there long after she had fallen asleep, the quiet ticking of the clock filling the room. He studied the child who had entered his life so abruptly, trying to make sense of the sudden shift in his own heart. He had built his life on discipline, on never allowing the unexpected to dictate his actions, yet here he was, rearranging his world around a barefoot girl he had found at a bus stop. He knew there would be questions, challenges, perhaps even battles with the system that would not care about promises or instinct. But none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was the child asleep in his chair, wrapped in his blanket, safe for the first time in what was likely far too long. As he watched her chest rise and fall in steady rhythm, he realized with startling clarity that he had no intention of letting her go back to the life she had come from. He didn't know what the road ahead would look like, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: Emily would never again stand shivering in the cold, waiting for someone who would never come. The next morning the house felt different, though nothing in it had physically changed. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting golden patterns across the polished floors and expensive furniture, but for the first time Richard noticed how empty it all looked. He had lived surrounded by marble, glass, and art for years, and yet it had always been silent, sterile, more like a museum than a home. Now, as he walked down the hallway toward the living room, he could hear the faint sound of movement and the soft creak of a chair. The sound was small, almost insignificant, but it altered the atmosphere of the house in a way he had never experienced. Emily was awake, sitting cross-legged in the oversized armchair where she had fallen asleep. The blanket was still wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and her teddy bear was pressed close to her chest. Her blonde hair was tangled from the night, and her eyes, though heavy with fatigue, were watchful. She didn't look like a child waking in safety, she looked like someone who had been forced to sleep in unfamiliar places too many times and had learned to stay alert even while resting. Richard approached carefully, not wanting to startle her. He greeted her softly, and though she didn't answer, she gave the smallest nod, acknowledging his presence. He offered her breakfast, unsure of what children her age liked. His kitchen was always stocked with what chefs or assistants provided for formal meals, but very little of it was meant for a 5-year-old. He scrambled eggs himself, burning the first batch before producing something edible, and placed the plate in front of her along with a glass of milk. She hesitated at first, her eyes flicking between the plate and his face, waiting for some sign. When he told her it was for her, she picked up the fork and began to eat, slowly at first and then with the quiet urgency of someone unused to regular meals. Watching her chew carefully, crumbs catching at the corner of her lips, Richard felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest, the recognition of how much she had been denied in such a short life. The rest of the morning passed in awkward coexistence. Richard returned to his office to look through emails and calls that had piled up, but his mind kept drifting toward the small figure who now wandered his home. Emily didn't stray far, always staying near the threshold of whichever room he occupied, never stepping fully inside but never leaving either. She carried her bear everywhere, dragging the blanket behind her like a shield, her eyes scanning constantly as if expecting to be told she wasn't allowed. It struck Richard that his house, with its grand spaces and luxury, might be the least comforting place for a child who had only known loss. At one point he found her in the library, standing on tiptoe to reach the lowest shelf. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, she simply traced her fingers along the spines of books, the gesture hesitant, reverent. He crouched down beside her and pulled out a children's book, one he didn't even know he owned, probably left by a guest long ago. He handed it to her, and though she didn't smile, her eyes softened with cautious interest. She sat cross-legged on the rug, flipping through the pages, whispering to her bear as if telling him the story. Richard watched from his desk, unable to focus on his work, realizing that in her silence she spoke volumes about what it meant to exist between worlds, too young to understand abandonment fully but old enough to feel its sharp edges. That evening, he showed her the guest room he had prepared. The bed was large, the sheets crisp and clean, the curtains drawn back to reveal the city lights beyond. She climbed onto the bed but didn't lie down. Instead, she sat at the edge, her bear in her lap, staring at the door. Hours later, when Richard checked in on her, he found the bed still perfectly made. He searched the room in sudden panic before opening the closet, where she had wedged herself into the corner, the blanket around her shoulders, the bear tight in her arms. Her eyes met his, wide and uncertain. "Why are you here, Emily?" he asked softly, crouching down. Her voice was barely audible. "Because closets are safer. People don't find you there." The simplicity of her answer stunned him. It wasn't a game or a quirk of childhood imagination, it was survival. She had learned that open spaces meant danger, that beds could be places where promises were broken, that safety was only found in shadows. Richard swallowed hard, forcing down the anger he felt, not at her, but at the world that had taught her this. "You don't have to hide here," he said, his voice low but firm. "No one is going to hurt you in this house. Not while I'm here." For a long time she didn't move, didn't speak. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she asked, "Are you going to send me back?" The answer came easily, without hesitation. "No. I won't send you back. You're safe here with me." Something shifted in her gaze then. It wasn't trust yet, not fully, but the first fragile thread of it. Her grip on the bear loosened, just slightly, and her shoulders relaxed enough to show that she was listening. Richard remained there until she drifted into sleep, her small body curled in the corner of the closet. He left the door ajar, the hallway light spilling inside, and as he walked back through the silent house he realized that his life had already changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had entered that night a man defined by business, by reputation, by the trappings of success. Now, in the quiet of his home, he understood that nothing he had built mattered as much as the fragile trust of a child who had been left with nothing but a teddy bear and a memory of loss. He had made her a promise, and for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of a vow that was more important than any deal he had ever signed. Richard spent the following days balancing the strange duality of his life. On one side, there was the constant flood of obligations from the empire he had built, phone calls from board members, contracts waiting for his signature, numbers and deals that demanded his attention. On the other side, there was the quiet presence of Emily, a child whose very existence had forced him to pause and reevaluate everything he thought he understood about responsibility. The contrast between the two worlds became sharper each day, and though he had always prided himself on control, he began to realize that control meant little when faced with a child who flinched at sudden noises or clung to a teddy bear as though it were the last anchor holding her to this earth. The first step had been to call and help discreetly. Richard hired a doctor to perform a full evaluation, wanting to be certain that Emily was healthy, but also hoping for guidance on how to address her fear. The doctor confirmed what he had already suspected: she was underweight, clearly neglected, but otherwise resilient. Still, he warned that trauma left invisible wounds and that patience would be the only medicine that mattered. Richard listened carefully, absorbing the advice, but privately he felt a surge of frustration at the idea of leaving healing to time alone. He wanted to fix things for her the way he solved problems in business, quickly, efficiently, permanently. Yet every time he tried to approach Emily with directness, she reminded him in her silence and her wary glances that this was not a negotiation to be won, but a fragile trust to be earned inch by inch. Meanwhile, the questions about her past gnawed at him. He hired a private investigator, someone he had used before in matters of corporate discretion, and demanded answers about where the girl had come from and who had left her in such a state. The report came faster than he expected, and the contents unsettled him deeply. Emily's mother was alive but lying in a hospital in a persistent coma after a car accident. Her father had disappeared shortly afterward, leaving the girl behind with nothing but vague promises. It was abandonment, pure and simple, cruel in a way that Richard struggled to comprehend. He closed the file with his jaw clenched, knowing that if he allowed himself to linger on the man's actions, his rage would consume him. That evening, Emily sat on the floor of the living room with a puzzle spread before her, the teddy bear propped beside her as if it too were helping her piece the image together. Richard lowered himself to the rug across from her, loosening his tie and setting aside his phone. For a long while, they worked in silence, the only sound the quiet click of puzzle pieces fitting into place. Finally, Emily glanced up at him, her expression cautious, and whispered, "Do you know where my mom is?" The question pierced him. He knew the truth, but looking into her wide, fragile eyes, he couldn't bring himself to deliver the brutal reality. Instead, He chose honesty without cruelty. "She's very sick," he said carefully. "She's in a hospital right now, and the doctors are helping her. That's why she couldn't come back for you." Emily lowered her gaze, her fingers tracing the edge of a puzzle piece. "So she didn't forget me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Richard leaned forward, his tone steady. "No, Emily. She didn't forget you. She can't be here, but that's not the same as forgetting." Something in her shoulders eased at his words, though the sadness in her eyes didn't vanish. She picked up another piece and placed it on the puzzle, more certain now, as if she had needed that reassurance before continuing. Later that night, when he carried her to bed, she had fallen asleep curled on the rug with her teddy bear still in her arms. He realized how natural the motion felt. He tucked her under the covers, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, and paused at the door longer than he meant to. He thought about the file waiting in his office, the cold facts about her parents' failures, and he thought about the girl in the bed who had survived despite them. She had no one else left in the world, and though he had not sought this role, he now knew he was incapable of walking away. In the solitude of his study, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out over the city skyline. Deals and contracts no longer carried the weight they once had. He was no longer thinking about mergers or profits, he was thinking about bedtime routines, about schools, about how to keep a child safe in a world that had already shown her its cruelest side. For the first time in years, the future seemed unpredictable, not because of markets or competitors, but because of the small girl asleep down the hall. Yet as daunting as it was, he felt something he had not felt in decades, a sense of purpose that went deeper than ambition. By the time he finished the drink, he had already made a decision. He would not allow her to slip into the machinery of the system, to vanish into foster homes or institutions that could never give her what she needed. He would fight for her, not because he pitied her, but because he knew in his bones that she was meant to be with him. The vow he made to himself was silent, but unshakable. Emily Carter would never be abandoned again, not as long as he drew breath. The first real challenge came sooner than Richard had expected. Only a week after Emily had settled into his home, after she had begun to sleep through most of the night and eat without looking over her shoulder, the first letter from social services arrived. It was formal, written in the dry language of bureaucracy, and it informed him that Emily was now under the care of the state, that her placement with him was temporary, and that a review would determine whether she should be sent to foster care. The words ignited something deep inside him, a mixture of anger and disbelief, because nowhere in that carefully typed letter was there recognition of the child herself, the girl who still hid in closets and whispered to her teddy bear at night. She had become a case file, a number, another lost child in a system that couldn't possibly understand the damage already done to her. Richard called his attorney immediately, and within days he was standing in a courthouse for the first hearing. He had walked into courtrooms before, always with the cool confidence of a man who knew the weight of his fortune and reputation, but this time felt different. There were no shareholders or government contracts at stake, no corporate interests to protect. It was only Emily, sitting small and fragile beside her advocate, her wide eyes darting around the room, her little hands clinging to the bear as though the courtroom itself might swallow her whole. Richard sat close enough that she could see him, hoping that his presence alone might give her strength. The proceedings began in the measured rhythm of law, with voices raised not in passion but in practiced neutrality. The state's representative argued that a wealthy businessman, however generous, was not the same as a parent, that money could not substitute for family, and that placement with foster care would provide stability and normalization. Richard listened, his jaw tight, fighting to remain calm as Emily's very existence was reduced to abstract terms. His lawyer countered with evidence of the neglect she had suffered, the abandonment that had nearly left her to freeze on a street corner, and the care Richard had already provided, medical reports, photographs, testimony from the doctor who had examined her. But the turning point was not in the documents. It came when the judge, a stern man with gray hair and a voice that carried easily across the room, asked if Emily wished to say anything. The advocate glanced at her gently, encouraging her, and after a long silence she rose. She was so small that she seemed swallowed by the vast wooden bench, her legs dangling above the ground, but her voice, though soft, carried across the room in a way that silenced every shuffle of paper. She said that she had waited at the bus stop like her father told her, that she had tried to be good and stay put, but he had never come back. She said she had hugged her teddy bear because it was the only thing that kept her warm. Then she looked at Richard, her eyes full of something between fear and trust, and added, "He was the first person who stopped. He bought me a jacket. He didn't leave. I want to stay with him." The words were simple, spoken without flourish, but they carried more weight than any legal argument. The silence afterward was heavy, broken only by the judge's slow nod as he thanked her. She returned to her seat, clutching her bear, and Richard felt something inside him fracture. He wanted to scoop her up in that very moment, to shield her from the room full of strangers, but he forced himself to sit still, to let her bravery stand on its own. When it was his turn to speak, Richard did not present himself as the powerful CEO, the man who commanded thousands of employees and navigated billion-dollar deals. He stood as simply as he could, speaking not in the polished cadence of a businessman but in the steady tone of someone who had seen a child in pain and refused to walk away. He described the night he found her, the way she had whispered that she wasn't needed anymore, and how those words had stayed with him. He admitted that he could not replace the family she had lost, but he could promise her something she had never been given: safety, consistency, and someone who would not leave. By the time the hearing concluded, no decision had been given, but something had shifted. The judge's face remained unreadable, the lawyers continued to exchange arguments, but Richard could feel that the truth had been spoken plainly in a way that could not be ignored. He left the courtroom with Emily at his side, her small hand slipping into his as they walked down the long marble steps. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but he ignored them all, leaning down to tell her in a low, steady voice, "You did so well today. I'm proud of you." She looked up at him with tired eyes and whispered, "You won't let them take me, right?" It was not a question of law or paperwork, not something to be decided by signatures. It was a question of trust. And Richard, without hesitation, gave the only answer that mattered. "No, Emily. I won't let them take you." That night, after putting her to bed, he sat in his study, staring at the city lights outside his window. He knew the fight was only beginning. The state would push harder, the legal process would drag on, and there would be moments when the outcome would seem uncertain. But none of that shook the vow he had made to her. For a man who had once thought success was measured in power and wealth, Richard understood now that his greatest fight, and his greatest victory, would be keeping a promise to a child who had been told she wasn't wanted. She was wanted. She was needed. And he would prove it to the world if he had to tear down every wall of bureaucracy in his way. Weeks passed with the weight of uncertainty pressing down on both Richard and Emily, each day a balancing act between fragile hope and the looming threat of loss. On the surface, their lives began to take on the rhythm of something resembling normalcy. Emily started waking in the mornings without immediately reaching for her backpack and teddy bear, and though she still carried the bear from room to room, she sometimes set it down to play with puzzles or flipped through the books Richard brought her. At night, she no longer hid in closets. Instead, she fell asleep on the bed, though she often insisted on leaving the lamp on. Richard, in turn, found himself adjusting his life around her needs, stepping out of late meetings, ignoring phone calls he would once have answered instantly, and realizing that none of the deals he had once considered vital held the same importance as reading a storybook to a child who had been denied every comfort until now. But beneath this fragile calm was a storm that was beginning to build. Emily's biological father, who had abandoned her, resurfaced when he realized that his estranged wife remained in a coma and the girl's future was being contested in court. His motives were transparent to Richard the moment he saw the man's first legal petition. It wasn't love or remorse driving him but opportunity. The petition was filled with promises of rehabilitation and claims of paternal rights, but to Richard it read like a performance staged for the court, a desperate attempt to regain control rather than a genuine desire to care for the child he had cast aside. The thought of Emily being returned to such a man twisted Richard's stomach with rage, though he knew he had to approach the matter with patience and strategy rather than the raw fury he felt. The second hearing was held in a larger courtroom, and this time it was filled not only with lawyers and officials but with reporters, their cameras flashing as Richard entered hand in hand with Emily. She wore a simple navy dress and shoes he had bought for her, her hair pulled back into neat braids, but her eyes betrayed her fear. Every time a camera clicked, she flinched slightly, tightening her grip on his hand. Richard bent down, whispering quietly that she didn't need to look at anyone but him, that all she had to do was stay by his side. She nodded, but her small face remained tense, as though she could sense the importance of what was unfolding. The father took the stand first, his words dripping with rehearsed sorrow. He spoke of hardship, of mistakes, of his supposed intention to rebuild his life. He claimed he had left Emily temporarily because he had been overwhelmed with grief over his wife's accident, painting himself as a man broken by tragedy rather than someone who had deliberately abandoned his child at a bus stop. Richard watched him carefully, every instinct as a businessman telling him the man was lying, manipulating, shaping a story to tug at the court's sympathy. But what disturbed Richard more than the performance was the thought that Emily might hear these words and wonder if they were true, that the child who still clung to fragments of love for her parents might be torn apart by conflicting emotions she was too young to resolve. When it was Richard's turn, he didn't raise his voice or rely on theatrics. He spoke plainly, recounting the night he had found Emily standing barefoot and shivering, how she had whispered that she wasn't wanted anymore, how she had survived not because of parental love but despite its absence. He described her progress since then, her improved health, her ability to sleep in a bed again, the way she had begun to laugh at small things. Then, looking directly at the judge, he said, "She has been through abandonment once. To place her back into the hands of someone who has already proven unwilling to protect her would not only be cruel, it would be a betrayal of everything she has managed to rebuild in herself. She deserves permanence, not another cycle of promises that will be broken." The judge listened carefully, but the most striking moment came when Emily was asked if she wanted to speak. She hesitated, looking up at Richard for reassurance. He nodded gently, letting her know she had the choice, not the obligation. Slowly, she walked to the front of the courtroom, her teddy bear tucked under her arm, and stood before the judge. Her voice was quiet, but the silence in the room made every word clear. She said that her father had told her to wait at the bus stop, that she had waited for a long time, but he hadn't come back. She said she had thought maybe she wasn't good enough, maybe she wasn't worth coming back for. Then she looked at Richard and said, "But he came. He didn't leave me. He stayed. I want to stay with him." The words broke through the polished language of the lawyers and the technical arguments of the court. They weren't statements prepared by adults, they were the truth of a child who had already lived more pain than she should have known. For a moment, the father tried to interrupt, insisting that she was confused, but the judge silenced him with a sharp glance. Emily returned to her seat, sliding back into Richard's side, her small body leaning against his arm as though she had spent the last of her courage and needed to rest. After the session ended, Richard carried her out of the courthouse, ignoring the questions hurled by reporters. In the car, she laid her head against his shoulder and whispered, "I said it out loud. I said I wanted to stay." Richard kissed the top of her head and told her she had been braver than anyone else in that room. She fell asleep before they reached home, still clutching her bear, and Richard sat for a long time in the parked car outside his mansion, unwilling to wake her. He knew the final ruling hadn't come yet, that there were still hurdles to face, but the bond between them had been spoken into existence in front of the world, undeniable and unbreakable. He understood now that he wasn't just fighting for her safety, he was fighting for her voice to be heard, for her truth to outweigh the lies of those who had failed her. And he knew that no matter how long the battle stretched, he would not stop until the court recognized what Emily had already chosen for herself, that her home was with him. The day of the final hearing arrived with an air of tension that seemed to settle over every corner of the courthouse. Richard woke earlier than usual, unable to quiet his mind, and found himself standing at Emily's doorway long before she stirred. She was still asleep, curled on her side with her teddy bear tucked against her chest, her face softened by dreams, and for a moment he simply watched her, feeling the weight of what was at stake pressing harder than ever before. Today would decide whether she remained in his care or was pulled back into a system that had already failed her. He promised himself silently that no matter what arguments were raised, he would not allow her to lose the fragile stability she had found in his home. When they arrived at the courthouse, the building felt colder than usual, as though the walls themselves understood the significance of what was about to unfold. Reporters crowded the entrance, cameras flashing, their voices rising in a storm of questions about the unusual case of a billionaire CEO fighting for custody of a little girl who had been abandoned. Richard ignored them, shielding Emily with his arm as they entered. She walked beside him in her navy dress, her braids tied neatly with ribbons, her small hand clinging to his as if it were the only thing anchoring her in the chaos. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. The lawyers prepared their final statements, the judge reviewed files with a stern expression, and Richard sat with Emily close to him, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder to remind her that he was there. The proceedings began with formal arguments, the state once again insisting that procedure and precedent favored removal into the foster system, while the biological father's attorney attempted to paint him as a man ready for redemption. Yet every word seemed rehearsed, detached, void of the lived truth that Richard carried in his memory of that first night when he had found Emily barefoot and trembling at a bus stop. When it was Richard's turn to speak, he stood slowly, steadying himself before the court. He spoke not as a CEO used to commanding boardrooms but as a man who had witnessed the cruelty of abandonment and chosen to step into the breach. He described the nights Emily had hidden in closets because she didn't trust the safety of a bed, the way she had whispered that she wasn't wanted, and the small, miraculous changes that had occurred since she had come into his home, how she now asked to be read stories, how she had begun to smile when she solved puzzles, how she had slowly started to laugh like a child again. He admitted openly that he had not sought fatherhood, that he had not planned for this, but that from the moment Emily placed her tiny hand in his at that bus stop, he knew he could not and would not leave her. His words were not dramatic, but they carried a weight born of sincerity, and the room seemed to grow still around him. The judge turned at last to Emily, asking if she wanted to say anything. She hesitated, her small hands gripping the teddy bear, her eyes searching Richard's face. He gave her a slight nod, telling her without words that she was free to speak or stay silent. With trembling legs, she walked to the front of the room. Her voice was quiet but unwavering as she said, "I waited for my dad, but he didn't come back. I thought it was my fault. Then she pointed to Richard, stopped and gave me a jacket. He told me to come with him, and I did. He hasn't left me since. I don't want to go anywhere else. I want to stay with him because he's my family now." The words were simple, but they struck with more force than any legal argument that had been made. Silence hung heavy after she finished. The judge's expression softened as he adjusted his glasses, then leaned forward to deliver his decision. His voice carried finality and gravity as he declared that Emily would remain permanently in Richard Hunter's custody. The gavel struck, a sharp sound that seemed to shatter the tension in the room, and in that instant Richard felt an overwhelming release of relief and gratitude. He looked down to see Emily staring up at him, her eyes wide as if she couldn't quite believe what had been said. "Does this mean I don't have to leave?" she whispered. Richard knelt, pulling her close, and told her with absolute certainty, "It means you're home forever." As they left the courthouse together, the press once again surged forward, shouting questions and snapping photos, but Richard barely registered them. All that mattered was the small hand holding his, no longer trembling, no longer uncertain. Emily no longer looked over her shoulder in fear. Instead, she walked with her head lifted just slightly, as if she had finally been given permission to believe in tomorrow. That evening, back at the house, Emily sat at the piano Richard had almost never touched, her tiny fingers pressing hesitant notes that echoed softly through the hall. Richard stood in the doorway, watching her with a quiet smile, realizing that the mansion, once so sterile and cold, was no longer a monument to his success but a living home. When Emily turned to him, her voice was tentative but filled with hope. "Can I call you Dad now?" she asked. Richard crossed the room, kneeling beside her so they were eye level, and answered simply, "You already do. You always have." Later that night, when he tucked her into bed, Emily whispered against her teddy bear, "I'm not alone anymore." Richard stayed beside her until she drifted into sleep, the weight of her trust anchoring him more firmly than any business empire ever had. For the first time in years, he felt whole, not because of the fortune he had built but because of the little girl who had given him something he hadn't known he was missing, a family.